You've seen it 1,000 times. The camera sweeps over a hilltop fortress, its towers catching the last light of a golden sunset. Torches flicker in iron sconces. A fire roars in a cavernous stone hearth. A lord sits at a feast table surrounded by laughter and wine. The music swells, and somewhere in the back of your mind, a small, seductive voice whispers, "What would it have been like to live there?" That voice is lying to you. Not a little, not with minor omissions, completely, ruthlessly, and with absolutely no remorse. Because here's what the camera never shows you. It never lingers on the morning after. It never follows that lord from the great hall to his private bedchamber, a journey of perhaps 40 feet that drops the temperature by 30 degrees. It never shows the breath fogging in front of his face the moment he steps away from the fire. It never captures the frost that has crept across the stone floor overnight, the ice forming in the ceramic wash basin on the side table, or the way the bed curtains, heavy wool and all, have gone stiff at the edges where the condensation from last night's breathing crystallized in the cold. Those images don't sell romantic historical dramas, but they are the truth. Tonight, we're going to live that truth. Not observe it from a safe, scholarly distance. Live it. You are going to step out of your modern bed with its central heating humming softly in the walls, its memory foam mattress, its duvet filled with synthetic down, and you are going to trade all of it for a stone chamber in a northern European castle sometime around the 13th century. And then, hour by hour, we're going to figure out how you're going to survive until morning. Because surviving the night was not a metaphor. It was not hyperbole. It was, for a significant number of people, in a significant number of winters, a genuine and mortal challenge. Let's start with the most fundamental misunderstanding most people carry about medieval castles: the idea that they were homes. They were not. They were weapons. Every single decision in their design, the thick walls, the narrow windows, the elevated position on a hilltop, the internal layout of long corridors and multiple heavy doors, was made in service of one goal: keeping armed men out. The comfort of the people living inside was, architecturally speaking, an afterthought. Sometimes not even that. Stone, as a building material, has a property that engineers call thermal mass. In theory, this can be an advantage. Stone absorbs heat during the day and releases it slowly at night. In practice, in a northern European castle in January, it works almost entirely against you. The stone walls of a well-built medieval castle could be anywhere from 4 to 12 feet thick. 12 feet of solid limestone or granite doesn't just fail to radiate warmth, it actively stores cold. Think of it like a refrigerator that runs on the ambient temperature of the outside air. During a cold snap, those walls become reservoirs of accumulated cold. And no matter how many fires you light, no matter how many tapestries you hang, no matter how many bodies are crammed into a room, the walls are always pulling the heat out and storing it in their dense, dark interiors. A mainstream historical fact that puts this in perspective. Interior air temperatures in many recorded medieval castles during winter months have been estimated, based on surviving accounts, architectural analysis, and modern thermal modeling, to hover between 40 and 50 degrees Fahrenheit in occupied rooms during the day. At night, after the fires burned down, they could drop to within a few degrees of freezing. In the unoccupied wings of a large castle, and there were many, temperatures indoors sometimes matched or even fell below outdoor temperatures because the stone was so effective at trapping the cold. 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside. In a building where you were expected to sleep. And yet people did. For centuries, generation after generation, they lay down in these stone boxes, pulled layers of wool and fur over their bodies, pressed animals and servants close for warmth, whispered prayers against the darkness, and somehow, through a combination of ingenuity, desperation, cultural ritual, and sheer human stubbornness, made it to morning. This is the story of how they did it. It's a story about architecture and animals, about rituals and superstitions, about the physics of warmth and the psychology of cold. It's a story about what people are capable of when the alternative is freezing to death in their sleep. And woven through all of it is a thread of dark irony that we'll come back to repeatedly throughout this documentary, that for all their grandeur, all their wealth, all their tapestries and feather mattresses and silver warming pans, the lords and ladies of the great stone castles may not have slept any warmer than the peasants in their thatched wooden hovels down in the valley. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, you need to feel the cold. Imagine you are standing in the great hall of a northern English castle. Let's say it's January 1247. The feast is over. The fire in the central hearth, a massive stone-lined pit, big enough to burn entire logs, is still burning, but the servants have stopped adding wood, and the blaze that roared at dinner has settled into a sullen, crackling thing. Most of the guests have gone. The trestle tables are being dismantled. A dog gnaws at something under the rushes in the far corner. The candles in the iron sconces are guttering in a draft that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The heat from the fire reaches you if you stand within about 8 feet of it. Beyond that, the air cools rapidly. The stone floor underfoot radiates cold upward through the soles of your leather boots. Your cloak is pulled tight, but the gap at the throat is letting in a thread of air that feels like a wire of ice pressed against your neck. You have to cross the hall, climb a spiral staircase, and walk 30 feet down a corridor to reach your chamber. This is your life. This is every night, and you already know what waits for you at the end of that walk. Let's go find out how to survive it. Let's also dispel the second great lie, which follows immediately from the first. Movies don't just warm the castle. They warm it selectively. They show you fires at their peak, fresh logs, high flame, dramatic light. They don't show you the same fire 3 hours later, when it has burned down to low coals, and the stone walls that were slightly warm from the earlier blaze have already absorbed all of that warmth back into themselves and radiated it outward into the winter air. The stone doesn't care how much wood you burned. The stone remembers the cold. The third lie is architectural. On screen, castle chambers are large, well lit, and filled with beautiful objects. The beds are enormous, the ceilings are high, the windows are generous. There's a sense of space and grandeur that reads as a luxury. In reality, the combination of high ceilings, large windows, and massive volume that read as grand on screen were precisely the features that made these rooms impossible to heat. You cannot maintain warmth in a volume that large with the technology available in 1250. You can heat a corner of it, a hemisphere around the fireplace, and everything else remains cold. Grand and cold, impressive and cold, expensive and cold. The fourth lie is the fire itself. Movie fires are enormous, roaring, constant things, always at their peak, always photogenic, throwing warm light across the faces of the characters. Real castle fires required constant, expensive maintenance. Wood was a significant operating cost for a medieval castle. One historian estimated that heating a large English castle through a single winter required something equivalent to clearing several acres of managed woodland. The expense was real. The labor of collecting, splitting, seasoning, and hauling the wood was real. And even with all of that effort, the fires couldn't maintain the castle at a comfortable temperature. They could make specific spots, the immediate vicinity of the hearth, bearable. The rest of the building remained what the building always was, a stone box in a northern climate. So when we talk tonight about how medieval people survived the cold of their own homes, we're not talking about a slight inconvenience they had to manage. We're talking about a genuine, persistent, life-threatening challenge that required constant, intelligent, experienced management. We're talking about thermal survival as a daily practice. We're talking about a world where the ability to get through a winter night without serious cold damage to your body was a skill. It's passed down through generations, refined by centuries of trial and error, embedded in household routines and cultural practices and folk medicine and spiritual ritual. We're talking about what it actually took to be warm when the world was made of stone and the wind was made of winter, and the only heat was what you could make yourself. You've seen it 1,000 times. The camera sweeps over a hilltop fortress, its towers catching the last light of a golden sunset. Torches flicker in iron sconces. A fire roars in a cavernous stone hearth. A lord sits at a feast table surrounded by laughter and wine. The music swells, and somewhere in the back of your mind, a small, seductive voice whispers, "What would it have been like to live there?" That voice is lying to you, not a little, it never shows the breath fogging in front of his face the moment he steps away from the fire. It never captures the frost that has crept across the stone floor overnight, the ice forming in the ceramic wash basin on the side table, or the way the bed curtains, heavy wool and all, have gone stiff at the edges where the condensation from last night's breathing crystallized in the cold. Those images don't sell romantic historical dramas, but they are the truth. Tonight, we're going to live that truth. Not observe it from a safe, scholarly distance. Live it. You are going to step out of your modern bed with its central heating humming softly in the walls, its memory foam mattress, its duvet filled with synthetic down, and you are going to trade all of it for a stone chamber in a northern European castle sometime around the 13th century. And then, hour by hour, we're going to figure out how you're going to survive until morning. Because surviving the night was not a metaphor. It was not hyperbole. It was, for a significant number of people, in a significant number of winters, a genuine and mortal challenge. Let's start with the most fundamental misunderstanding most people carry about medieval castles: the idea that they were homes. They were not. They were weapons. Every single decision in their design, the thick walls, the narrow windows, the elevated position on a hilltop, the internal layout of long corridors and multiple heavy doors, was made in service of one goal: keeping armed men out. The comfort of the people living inside was, architecturally speaking, an afterthought. Sometimes not even that. Stone, as a building material, has a property that engineers call thermal mass. In theory, this can be an advantage. Stone absorbs heat during the day and releases it slowly at night. In practice, in a northern European castle in January, it works almost entirely against you. The stone walls of a well-built medieval castle could be anywhere from 4 to 12 feet thick. 12 feet of solid limestone or granite doesn't just fail to radiate warmth, it actively stores cold. Think of it like a refrigerator that runs on the ambient temperature of the outside air. During a cold snap, those walls become reservoirs of accumulated cold. And no matter how many fires you light, no matter how many tapestries you hang, no matter how many bodies are crammed into a room, the walls are always pulling the heat out and storing it in their dense, dark interiors. A mainstream historical fact that puts this in perspective: interior air temperatures in many recorded medieval castles during winter months have been estimated, based on surviving accounts, architectural analysis, and modern thermal modeling, to hover between 40 and 50 degrees Fahrenheit in occupied rooms during the day. At night, after the fires burned down, they could drop to within a few degrees of freezing. In the unoccupied wings of a large castle, and there were many, temperatures indoors sometimes matched or even fell below outdoor temperatures because the stone was so effective at trapping the cold. 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside. In a building where you were expected to sleep. And yet, people did. For centuries, generation after generation, they lay down in these stone boxes, pulled layers of wool and fur over their bodies, pressed animals and servants close for warmth, whispered prayers against the darkness, and somehow, through a combination of ingenuity, desperation, cultural ritual, and sheer human stubbornness, made it to morning. This is the story of how they did it. It's a story about architecture and animals, about rituals and superstitions, about the physics of warmth and the psychology of cold. It's a story about what people are capable of when the alternative is freezing to death in their sleep. And woven through all of it is a thread of dark irony that we'll come back to repeatedly throughout this documentary. That for all their grandeur, all their wealth, all their tapestries and feather mattresses and silver warming pans, the lords and ladies of the great stone castles may not have slept any warmer than the peasants in their thatched wooden hovels down in the valley. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, you need to feel the cold. Imagine you are standing in the Great Hall of a northern English castle. Let's say it's January 1247. The feast is over. The fire in the central hearth, a massive stone-lined pit, big enough to burn entire logs, is still burning, but the servants have stopped adding woo. The corridor hits you the moment you step out of the Great Hall. It's not that the temperature drops significantly, though it does. It's the completeness of the cold out here. In the hall, even a fading fire creates a haze of warmth, a slight softening of the air. Out in the corridor, there is no such haze. The cold doesn't feel like an absence of heat. It feels like a presence, something with weight and intention, pressing against every inch of exposed skin, probing the gap at your collar, slipping between your fingers where your hands are clasped under your cloak. Your breath blooms white in the torchlight. You haven't stepped outside. You are still inside, behind walls that are in some places thicker than a full-grown man is tall, and you are already cold in a way that feels faintly threatening. This is the central paradox of medieval castle architecture, and it's worth spending real time here because it underpins everything that follows. The features that made castles militarily brilliant made them thermally catastrophic. Start with the walls themselves. Medieval military architects understood, even without the language of physics, that thick walls stopped things. Arrows, battering rams, fire arrows, siege engines. The thicker the wall, the more punishment it could absorb before failing. A well-built castle wall in the high medieval period might be 4 feet thick in a residential tower, 8 feet in a curtain wall, and 10 to 12 feet at the base of a major keep. These walls were not insulated. There was no cavity between inner and outer face, no layer of material with low thermal conductivity. It was solid stone, rubble, and mortar all the way through. And stone, as we've established, is a thermal sponge for cold. The specific heat capacity of limestone, one of the most common castle building materials, means it can absorb a remarkable amount of energy without changing temperature. In winter, and after weeks of freezing temperatures, the walls of a castle have absorbed so much cold that they function as enormous radiators of chill. You can warm the air in a room with a fire, but the moment that warm air touches the walls pull the heat out of it. This is why, even with a fire burning at full blast, people in medieval records consistently describe castle chambers as cold. Not just cool, cold. Uncomfortably, dangerously cold. Then there are the windows. Modern windows perform a function so basic, we don't even think about it. They let in light while keeping out air. Medieval castle windows, particularly in the earlier centuries, did neither especially well. The arrow slits, those narrow vertical openings in the exterior walls, were designed to let an archer shoot outward while presenting as small a target as possible to incoming fire. They were not designed to keep out wind, and they didn't. Cold air streamed through them regardless of weather, creating persistent drafts in any room that contained them. The larger window openings used for light and ventilation were typically covered with wooden shutters, better than nothing, but wood warps and contracts in cold weather, creating gaps. A tight-fitting shutter in September becomes a leaky, rattling barrier by February. Glass, when it existed in medieval castles, was reserved almost exclusively for chapels and the most prestigious private spaces. The lord's personal chambers, the solar, the lady's bower. And even that glass was not the clear, sealed, double-glazed panels of modern construction. It was thick, greenish, rippled, and set in lead cames that contracted in the cold, allowing drafts to whisper through. In the vast majority of castle rooms, window openings were covered with oiled linen or parchment. translucent enough to admit dim light, but not meaningfully better than the wooden shutters at stopping the wind. Some accounts mention the use of thin sheets of scraped animal horn, which were marginally sturdier and more weather-resistant, but no more insulating. Here's the quirky historical detail that tends to get left out of the romantic version of medieval castle life. In many surviving household accounts from 13th and 14th century England and France, the word most commonly associated with winter nights in castle chambers is not cozy or warm or even tolerable. It's drafty. Drafty with the casual specificity of someone describing a condition so universal and so consistently miserable that it doesn't even warrant emotional commentary anymore. The drafts were simply there, like the rats in the rushes and the smoke from the fires. A feature of the environment, not a problem to be solved. The position of the castle compounded everything. A castle's military value depended significantly on elevation. A hilltop fortress could see farther, commanded natural defensive advantages, and was harder to approach without being seen. But hilltops are windy, relentlessly, consistently, seasonally, brutally windy in ways that valley settlements simply aren't. Chronicles from the period are full of matter-of-fact references to wind that howls along the battlements, wind that drives rain sideways against the shutters, wind that finds its way into every crack and gap in the stone. In severe storms, this wind was strong enough to extinguish torches in the corridors, to snuff out candles through gaps in window frames, to turn the already cold air in a chamber into something that felt more like an active assault. Let's walk into the bedchamber now and look at what's waiting for you. The room is roughly 15 by 20 feet. The ceiling is vaulted stone, perhaps 14 feet above the floor at its peak. The walls are bare stone. There are tapestries, but we'll get to those. Slightly slick with condensation. The floor is covered with rushes. A layer of dried plant stalks and herbs spread directly over the flagstones. A fireplace occupies most of one wall. It's a large fireplace, as medieval domestic fireplaces go, perhaps 5 feet wide and 4 feet tall at the opening. Right now, a fire is burning in it, but you can already feel the limits of its power. Stand in front of that fire, close enough that your face is uncomfortably warm and your eyes sting from the smoke, and you'll notice something unsettling. Your back is cold. Not cool. Cold. The fire's heat doesn't distribute itself evenly through the room. It radiates outward in a roughly hemispherical pattern from the mouth of the fireplace, and it dissipates rapidly as it moves through the air. 6 feet from the fire, the warmth is pleasant. 10 feet from the fire, it's barely noticeable. 15 feet from the fire, which is approximately the distance to the bed in a room this size, the temperature may as well be the same as if the fire didn't exist. Medieval fireplaces, for all their dramatic size, were genuinely poor heating devices. They were essentially open holes in the wall, connected to the outdoors via a chimney shaft. The chimney drew air, warm air, heated air, the air you desperately needed, directly upward and out of the building. A well-drawing fire in a large medieval fireplace consumed enormous quantities of wood and sent most of the resulting heat straight up the chimney. One French lord's household accounts from the late 13th century record that his castle consumed the equivalent of over 40 cords of wood in a single winter, roughly equivalent to a stack of wood 4 feet tall, 4 feet wide, and 320 feet long. All of that wood burned. A fraction of its heat actually stayed in the building. Historians who study medieval domestic life have pointed out a further irony. The better the chimney draft, the worse the room heating. A fireplace with excellent draw, which was considered desirable because it reduced the amount of smoke that backed up into the room, was also more efficient at pulling warm air out of the space. The trade-off between smoke and cold was one that medieval castle inhabitants navigated constantly, and there was no good answer. More fire, more smoke, marginally more warmth, less smoke, slightly less warmth, cold and choked, or cold and clear. There were attempts to improve on this basic design. Iron firebacks, cast metal plates positioned at the rear of the fireplace, reflected some of the heat outward into the room rather than allowing it to be absorbed by the stone. Smaller, more enclosed fireplaces in later medieval construction were more efficient than the wide-open hearths of earlier periods. Some wealthy households installed heating systems inspired by Roman hypocausts, underfloor channels that distributed warm air, though these were expensive, high maintenance, and rarely seen outside the most prestigious buildings. For the vast majority of medieval castle inhabitants, in the vast majority of their years, the fireplace was what it appeared to be: a beautiful, expensive, inadequate heating device. Now look at those tapestries. The tapestries that line the walls of wealthy medieval chambers. Those magnificent, expensive, labor-intensive panels depicting hunting scenes and mythological narratives and religious stories served a dual purpose that most people today don't appreciate. Yes, they were status symbols. A high-quality Flemish tapestry in the 13th century cost roughly the equivalent of a knight's annual income. Displaying them was a statement about wealth and sophistication, but they were also, unambiguously, a thermal management strategy. A heavy tapestry hung against a stone wall creates a gap of still air between the fabric and the stone. Still air is an excellent insulator. It's the principle behind modern fiberglass insulation and double-glazed windows. The tapestry also reduces the direct radiation of cold from the stone surface into the room. Medieval inhabitants seem to have understood this empirically. Tapestry-hung rooms were consistently described as noticeably warmer than bare stone chambers, and noble households routinely carried their tapestries with them when they traveled, setting them up in whatever guest chambers they occupied. A French duchess in the late 14th century was recorded as having her favorite tapestries transported on a cart as part of her standard travel kit, not for show in unfamiliar settings, but because sleeping without them meant sleeping cold. The rushes on the floor deserve a similar analysis. These weren't decoration or mere convention. They were an insulating layer between you and the stone. Flagstone floors are among the coldest surfaces imaginable. Dense, massive, with no air pockets, absorbing warmth from any source that touches them and releasing it into the solid ground. A layer of dried rushes, several inches thick when freshly laid, compressed but still somewhat cushioning after some weeks of use, created a modest but real thermal barrier. It kept the coldest layer of air slightly above the floor, marginally above your feet when you stood. It also absorbed some of the moisture that condensed constantly in cold chambers, preventing the floor from becoming an ice rink of frozen condensation. The rushes were also, it must be said, disgusting. As the weeks wore on, they collected food scraps from meals eaten in the chamber, bones gnawed by dogs, spillage from ale and wine, dead insects, mouse droppings, and the general debris of daily life. Household accounts indicate they were typically replaced several times a year, in the biggest noble households, monthly or even more often. Between replacements, various aromatic herbs were scattered among them: lavender, rosemary, meadow herbs, to manage the smell. This helped. It didn't solve the problem. A visiting Venetian merchant who stayed in an English castle in 1397 noted with barely concealed distaste that the floor covering smelled, quote, of the stable and the kitchen in equal measure. He also noted, somewhat contradicting himself, that the room had been warm enough that he'd only needed 3 blankets to sleep. The rushes, disgusting as they were doing their job. So this is the environment you're dealing with. Stone walls that radiate cold. Windows that admit drafts. A fire that heats a hemisphere and nothing beyond it. A floor that pulls warmth from your feet. A ceiling that offers nothing. And outside, on the other side of those thick walls, a January night in northern England. You're going to need a very good strategy. Let's talk about how the people who lived here actually slept. One more architectural feature deserves attention before we move on to solutions: the problem of the corridor. In a large medieval castle, moving from one part of the building to another meant navigating corridors and passages that were among the most thermally hostile spaces in the entire structure. Narrow, stone-walled, typically unheated, open to the outside air through arrow slits and gaps in the stonework, and frequently acting as wind channels, the interior corridors of a medieval castle concentrated the drafts that the rooms themselves only suffered intermittently. Servants who moved through these corridors at night, carrying warming pans or fetching wood, were exposed to temperatures that could drop the core body temperature dangerously in minutes of sustained exposure. The design consequence of this was that medieval households tended to concentrate their sleeping as close together as possible within the warmest available section of the building. The scatter of family members across a large castle, the image of everyone in their own private chamber in their own wing, was not, in reality, how winter sleeping arrangements worked. People clustered. They occupied the rooms closest to the central heating sources. They left the peripheral chambers empty through the coldest months and retreated to the occupied core, warming it with their collective body heat and their collective fires, and letting the outer rooms freeze. The Great Hall, the largest, most central, most socially significant room in the castle, was not just a dining room. It was, in winter, the thermal heart of the building. Its fire was the largest. Its occupancy was the highest. Its body heat contribution was the most substantial. The rooms adjoining it, the solar above it, the chambers opening off the dais end, benefited from its warmth by proximity and shared airflow. The rooms at the far end of the keep, 3 stairwells and 2 corridors away from the hall fire, were essentially abandoned to the cold from November through February. Archaeological studies of medieval castle sites have found evidence of this thermal strategy in the distribution of fire damage, soot deposits, and wear patterns on floors. The areas that show heaviest occupation, the most soot, the most worn stone, the most repaired and relaid floor surfaces, cluster around the Great Hall and its immediate neighbors. The peripheral towers, for all their architectural impressiveness, show relatively light occupation, particularly in their upper stories. People knew where the warmth was, and they went there. The natural consequence was that social hierarchy and thermal access overlapped almost completely. The lord and lady of the household slept closest to the warmth. Their immediate household, senior servants, personal attendants, family members, occupied the next ring. The outer rings. The less senior, less important, less socially protected members of the household slept in the colder spaces, not because anyone planned it this way as a deliberate cruelty, but because warmth was a limited resource. Proximity to warmth was desirable, and proximity to warmth was determined by status. Cold was not equally distributed in a medieval castle. It was, like every other resource, subject to the hierarchies of the world it inhabited. One particularly striking example comes from the archaeological record of a well-preserved English castle from the late 13th century. Analysis of the sleeping spaces by a team of historical archaeologists found that the Lord's Chamber, the innermost, highest status, warmest room in the occupied section of the keep, showed evidence of burning high-quality charcoal in a small brazier in addition to the main fireplace. This supplementary heating source, which would have been expensive and somewhat dangerous, charcoal produces carbon monoxide, and medieval rooms were not well ventilated enough to make this entirely safe, was apparently worth both the expense and the risk for the warmth it provided. The servants' sleeping areas, 3 rooms away, showed evidence of a single shared fire maintained at minimal levels through the night. The difference in overnight temperature between the Lord's Chamber and the outer servants' room, based on the archaeologists' thermal modeling, was estimated at between 8 and 15 degrees Fahrenheit. Not enormous in absolute terms, but enormous in terms of the quality of sleep, the risk of cold-related illness, and the simple daily experience of comfort and discomfort. Status in a medieval castle was partly defined by how cold you were allowed to be. Wadi and the blaze that roared at dinner has settled into a sullen, crackling thing. Most of the guests have gone. The trestle tables are being dismantled. A dog gnaws at something under the rushes in the far corner. The candles in the iron sconces are guttering in a draft that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The heat from the fire reaches you if you stand within about 8 feet of it. Beyond that, the air cools rapidly. The stone floor underfoot radiates cold upward through the soles of your leather boots. Your cloak is pulled tight, but the gap at the throat is letting in a thread of air that feels like a wire of ice pressed against your neck. You have to cross the hall, climb a spiral staircase, and walk 30 feet down a corridor to reach your chamber. This is your life. This is every night, and you already know what waits for you at the end of that walk. Let's go find out how to survive it. Let's also dispel the second great lie, which follows immediately from the first. Movies don't just warm the castle, they warm it selectively. They show you fires at their peak, fresh logs, high flame, dramatic light. They don't show you the same fire 3 hours later, when it has burned down to low coals and the stone walls that were slightly warm from the earlier blaze have already absorbed all of that warmth back into themselves and radiated it outward into the winter air. The stone doesn't care how much wood you burned. The stone remembers the cold. The third lie is architectural. On screen, castle chambers are large, well lit, and filled with beautiful objects. The beds are enormous. The ceilings are high. The windows are generous. There's a sense of space and grandeur that reads as luxury. In reality, the combination of high ceilings, large windows, and massive volume that read as grand on screen were precisely the features that made these rooms impossible to heat. You cannot maintain warmth in a volume that large with the technology available in 1250. You can heat a corner of it, a hemisphere around the fireplace, and everything else remains cold. Grand and cold, impressive and cold, expensive and cold. The fourth lie is the fire itself. Movie fires are enormous, roaring, constant things, always at their peak, always photogenic, throwing warm light across the faces of the characters. Real castle fires required constant, expensive maintenance. Wood was a significant operating cost for a medieval castle. One historian estimated that heating a large English castle through a single winter required something equivalent to clearing several acres of managed woodland. The expense was real. The labor of collecting, splitting, seasoning, and hauling the wood was real. And even with all of that effort, the fires couldn't maintain the castle at a comfortable temperature. They could make specific spots, the immediate vicinity of the hearth, bearable. The rest of the building remained what the building always was, a stone box in a northern climate. So when we talk tonight about how medieval people survived the cold of their own homes, we're not talking about a slight inconvenience they had to manage. We're talking about a genuine, persistent, life-threatening challenge that required constant, intelligent, experienced management. We're talking about thermal survival as a daily practice. We're talking about a world where the ability to get through a winter night without serious cold damage to your body was a skill passed down through generations, refined by centuries of trial and error, embedded in household routines and cultural practices and folk medicine and spiritual ritual. We're talking about what it actually took to be warm when the world was made of stone and the wind was made of winter, and the only heat was what you could make yourself. The medieval bed is not furniture. Let's get that straight right now. It is a life support system. Walk into a well-appointed noble bedchamber in the 13th or 14th century, a lord's private room, a lady's bower, the guest chamber prepared for a visiting bishop, and the bed will dominate the room the way a ship's hull dominates a harbor. These are not the modest, low-to-the-ground platform beds of modern minimalist design. These are structures, tall structures. The posts rise to 6, 7, 8 feet. The frame is built from seasoned hardwood, oak, walnut, sometimes cherry. jointed and pegged with the skill of a craftsman who knows this piece of furniture will outlast its owner by generations. The mattress, we'll get to the mattress, sits at waist height or higher, and surrounding all of it, running from the canopy at the top to within a foot of the floor on all sides, hang heavy curtains. Those curtains are the point. Here is the genius of the four-poster canopy bed, stripped of all its aesthetic romance and reduced to pure thermal engineering. It turns a single large cold room into two spaces. One large space, approximately 15 by 20 feet, which is very cold, and one small space, approximately 6 feet by 4 feet by 7 feet, which is the interior of the bed enclosure, and which is dramatically, meaningfully, survivably warmer. The physics are straightforward. A human body at rest produces roughly 80 watts of heat, the equivalent of an old-fashioned light bulb. In a large cold room, those 80 watts disperse instantly into the surrounding air and make essentially no measurable difference to the overall temperature. But inside a small enclosure of heavy curtains with a mattress below trapping heat from below and a canopy above preventing heat from rising away, those 80 watts accumulate. They warm the air in the enclosure. They warm the bedding. And the warmed bedding insulates the body, which reduces heat loss, which means more of those 80 watts stay in the system instead of escaping. On a cold winter night, the difference in temperature between the interior of a well-curtained medieval bed and the ambient air in the same room could be 10, 15, even 20 degrees Fahrenheit. In a room hovering at 40 degrees, that's the difference between sleeping in a space that's merely uncomfortable and sleeping in a space that's genuinely threatening. A French duchess in the late 1300s was known to travel with her bed fully dismantled and packed on a train of carts. Not just the bedding, the entire wooden frame, posts, canopy, the works. When her household arrived at a destination, her servant's first task was reassembling her bed in whatever chamber had been assigned to her. Only then, with the four-poster structure in place and the curtains hung, would she consider the room habitable. The bed wasn't luxury. The bed was shelter. Now let's talk about what went inside that shelter. Because the curtains alone, brilliant as they were only the beginning. The mattress debate in medieval households was essentially a class war. At the top of the social pyramid, the feather bed. At the bottom, the straw tick. And the gap between them was not merely a matter of comfort, it was a matter of warmth, and warmth was survival. A feather bed in the high medieval period was exactly what it sounds like, a large cloth sack stuffed with the down and feathers of ducks or geese. A well-stuffed feather mattress could be 6 to 8 inches deep, sometimes more. It was soft, obviously, but more importantly, it was an extraordinary thermal insulator. Down, the small, fluffy underlayer of feathers close to a bird's skin, is still used today in sleeping bags rated to extreme cold because of its exceptional ability to trap air in tiny pockets, creating an insulating matrix that is warm without being heavy. A medieval feather bed operated on exactly this principle. Lying in one, you sank into a deep, warm embrace that held your body heat close and radiated it back at you. The problem, and there was a problem, because there is always a problem, was that feather beds could become too warm. Accounts from the period describe sleepers waking in the night, drenched in sweat, overheated in their feathery cocoons, fighting their way to the surface of the mattress like a person climbing out of quicksand. A 15th century English letter writer complained memorably that his host's feather bed had swallowed him entire, so that he might not turn without the labor of a man wrestling a great bull. He survived, presumably, but he didn't sound happy about it. Feather beds were also, by any practical definition, aristocratic objects. They were expensive to fill, labor-intensive to maintain, and prone to being eaten by insects and small mammals if not properly stored. Household inventories from noble estates list feather beds alongside silver plate and fine linen as treasured possessions, carefully catalogued and specifically bequeathed in wills. Families who owned multiple feather beds were families of real substance. The straw tick was the reality for everyone else. A straw tick was a canvas sack stuffed with straw, hay, or dried grasses. In better circumstances, the straw was mixed with dried herbs for fragrance and pest deterrence. The result was a mattress that was lumpy, uneven, scratchy through the canvas, prone to harboring insects and small vermin, and gradually compressed by use until it offered almost no cushioning at all. The thermal properties of a straw tick were modest at best. Straw has some insulating value, more than bare stone or bare wood, certainly, but it compressed quickly under a person's weight, losing much of that insulating airspace, and a compressed straw tick on a cold stone floor, after a month or two of use, was offering precious little protection from the cold emanating upward from the flagstones, which is one reason why the bed frame itself was raised high off the floor. The conventional explanation is that this kept the sleeper away from drafts, which pooled near the floor, and that's partially true. Cold air is denser than warm air and settles near the floor, so sleeping elevated meant sleeping in marginally warmer air. But there was also a simple thermal logic. The higher you were off the stone floor, the less directly the floor could radiate cold into your sleeping space. Over the mattress came the textiles, and here the medieval aristocracy were genuinely inventive. A typical noble bed in the high medieval period would have been layered from bottom to top, something like this: a linen sheet directly against the mattress, then another linen sheet over that, then one or more woolen blankets, heavy, tightly woven, substantial things, not the thin acrylic blankets of modern manufacture. Then, in cold weather, one or more fur coverlets. Then potentially additional wool blankets over the furs. Then, if it was particularly cold, one's outer garments laid over the whole pile. Wool, layered over the linen, provided the bulk of the insulation. Wool has a property, retained in part from the living animal, called lanolin, a waxy, slightly greasy substance that persists in unwashed wool and makes it somewhat water-resistant, and which also helps it retain heat even when damp. Medieval wool blankets were often not fully washed. That would have stripped the lanolin, and they smelled accordingly, of sheep and rain, and something ancient and animal. But they were warm, genuinely, significantly warm. Above the wool, fur. The furs used in medieval noble households were extraordinary by modern standards, not just in their quality, but in their variety and quantity. Marten, fox, squirrel, ermine, sable, bear occasionally, sheepskin. The fur coats and bed coverings catalogued in estate inventories from the 13th through 15th centuries read like a survey of the mammal population of medieval Europe. A high-status fur coverlet, a thick panel of sewn pelts, often with the fur facing inward against the body, added a substantial additional layer of insulation and, not incidentally, considerable weight. The weight mattered. Pressed down, the coverings created a more complete seal around the body, reducing convective heat loss through the movement of air. There was also the question of what you wore to bed. The modern custom of sleeping in pajamas is actually the descendant of a very serious medieval tradition. People in the Middle Ages did not, generally speaking, go to bed naked or even minimally clothed. They went to bed wearing almost as much as they wore during the day, and sometimes more. The baseline was the nightgown or nightshirt, a long, loose garment, usually of linen, extending to the ankles or lower. Over that, the additional wool garments were common in cold weather, a second layer at the core, and over all of that, the nightcap, a close-fitting cloth cap that covered the skull and ears and was tied under the chin. The importance of the nightcap was not merely conventional. It was grounded in a correct, empirical observation that human bodies lose a disproportionate amount of heat through the head, and that covering the head during sleep meaningfully reduced overall heat loss. Medieval medical texts from the 13th and 14th centuries are surprisingly explicit about this. Physicians writing about winter health recommended covering the head as a primary preventive measure against what they called night chill, a condition they understood as genuinely dangerous, likely a combination of hypothermia and respiratory illness from breathing cold air. The nightcap wasn't a fashion accessory. It was prescribed medicine. The warming pan was the final piece of this microclimate strategy. Picture a long-handled pan, 12 to 18 inches in diameter, made of brass or copper, with a pierced lid through which heat could escape. The pan was filled with hot coals from the fire, sealed, and run back and forth between the bed sheets shortly before sleeping. The coals, through the perforated lid, radiated heat into the fabric, pre-warming the bedding and eliminating the shock of sliding into cold sheets that could, in a bad winter, feel almost physically painful. The warming pan appears consistently in household accounts and estate inventories from the later medieval period. Listed alongside the most basic domestic necessities, candles, chamber pots, fire irons. It was not a luxury item, it was equipment. In winters cold enough to freeze the wash water in the basin, sliding into pre-warmed sheets wasn't a comfort. It was a practical measure against muscle spasm and the kind of sudden cold shock that medieval medical writers associated with serious illness. The hazards were real, though. Warming pans in careless hands set sheets on fire. Account books from the period mention, with almost audible resignation, damaged linens, scorched mattresses, and in at least one documented case, a servant who set an entire chamber ablaze while preparing the master's bed. Medieval life was full of these trade-offs. The thing that might save you from one risk might kill you with another. But on a sufficiently cold night, and many winter nights in a northern castle were sufficiently cold, the risk was worth taking. You ran the warming pan, you climbed in, you pulled the curtains, and you lay in a space that was, against all odds, genuinely warm, for a little while at least. The seasonal calculus of textiles also deserves examination, because it was not a simple matter of piling on more fabric as the temperature dropped. Medieval people had sophisticated, if empirically rather than scientifically grounded, theories about which fabrics should touch the skin, which should go over, and in what order they should be layered. The basic principle, linen next to the body, wool over that, fur outermost, was widely consistent across documents from multiple European regions, suggesting a genuine consensus born of experience rather than arbitrary fashion. The logic of the ordering was partly hygienic and partly thermal. Linen, being smooth and relatively easy to wash, was the interface between the body and the world of fabric. It absorbed sweat and body oils without trapping them against the skin in ways that wool, with its coarser texture, would have. Linen also, in the logic of the time, had a cooling quality, an idea that was partly superstition, partly observation of linen's behavior in hot weather. It is actually somewhat better than wool at wicking moisture and allowing evaporative cooling, and partly theory about how certain fabrics interacted with the body's humors. The cooling linen was seen as creating a kind of balance with the heating wool above it. Wool's thermal properties are genuinely extraordinary. It is one of the most effective natural insulators available. Its insulating value comes from the way individual fibers crimp and form millions of tiny air pockets, each one trapping a small volume of still air that resists heat transfer. Wool maintains much of its insulating value even when damp, a property that synthetic insulators often struggle to match because the fiber structure allows it to absorb considerable moisture without the air pockets collapsing. In a stone chamber, where condensation was a constant feature of the air, wool's resistance to moisture-induced insulation loss was not merely convenient, it was practically essential. The heaviest, densest, most tightly woven wool was used for the outermost blanket layers, the ones in contact with the cold air inside the bed enclosure. These blankets were not the thin acrylic throws of contemporary manufacture. They were weighty, solid things. Household inventories from English noble estates in the 13th and 14th centuries describe individual blankets weighing several pounds each. A complete stack of winter bedding, mattress pad, linen sheets, 2 or 3 wool blankets, and a fur coverlet could weigh 20 or 30 pounds. This weight was not accidental. It was functional. Heavier covers created a more complete thermal seal around the body, reduced the convective movement of air through the bedding layers, and compressed the insulating materials together in ways that improved their overall performance. The fur coverlet, the outermost, most expensive, most status-significant component of the noble bedding stack, was something quite different from a simple blanket. A high-quality fur coverlet was a luxury object of the first order, and the variety of furs used tells us a great deal about both the global reach of the medieval luxury trade and the hierarchy of warmth-seeking that operated at the top of medieval society. Sable, the most prized and expensive fur in medieval Europe, came from Siberian weasels traded through the Russian and Mongol trade networks eastward. Ermine, the white winter coat of the stoat, was both highly insulating and deeply symbolic, associated with royalty and high nobility across Europe. Marten, fox, beaver, and otter were more commonly available and slightly less expensive, but still significant luxuries. What all of these furs shared, beyond their associations with wealth and status, was genuine and exceptional insulating performance. The dense, fine underfur of most cold-climate mammals is nature's answer to the same problem that medieval castle inhabitants were trying to solve: how to maintain body temperature in a cold environment without adding excessive weight. Arctic fox, for example, can survive in temperatures far below 0 Fahrenheit because its fur creates an insulating layer so effective that the animal's skin surface temperature can be 30 degrees above ambient, while the outer fur surface is essentially at ambient temperature. Wearing that fur, even a processed, sewn version of it, provides real, measurable thermal insulation that wool alone cannot match. The people who purchased these furs were not being irrational or purely vain. They were paying premium prices for premium thermal performance in a world where thermal performance was a matter of health and survival. The fur trade of the medieval period was, in a real sense, a survival goods industry, driven by demand from people who understood that they needed the best available insulation to survive their homes. One more element of the microclimate strategy that deserves attention is the role of the bed chamber itself as a managed space, not merely a room. In the period accounts and household manuals of the 13th through 15th centuries, we see evidence of careful, deliberate management of the bedchamber as a thermal environment. The positioning of the bed relative to the fireplace and the window, the use of screens and curtains to block specific drafts, the placement of chests and heavy furniture to create thermal barriers, the careful management of the door to balance ventilation against heat loss. The bed, we've established, was positioned away from the cold floor and enclosed by curtains. But the orientation of the bed within the room also mattered. Beds were typically positioned with their backs to the wall, often the wall with the fireplace, when possible, so that the bed curtains could capture some of the heat radiating from the still warm stone. Beds positioned perpendicular to the main draft path, rather than in line with it, were less prone to persistent drafts infiltrating the curtained enclosure. In larger, more elaborately appointed chambers, wooden screens, floor-to-ceiling paneled barriers, were sometimes positioned to direct drafts away from the bed, creating a zone of calm air in which the bed's microclimate could develop without constant disruption. The fireplace management in a bedchamber was a specialized skill. The goal was not maximum fire throughout the night that consumed too much wood and produced too much smoke. The goal was a carefully managed burn that would provide adequate warmth through the early evening, when the occupant was awake and moving, and then sustain a bed of coals through the night that would keep the room from dropping below dangerous temperatures while consuming minimal fuel. Getting this balance right required experience, judgment, and the ability to read the conditions of a particular room on a particular night. The severity of the cold, the direction of the wind, the state of the wood supply, the number of people in the room. The personal servant whose job included fire management was not performing a simple mechanical task. They were applying genuine, experience-based expertise to a problem with real consequences for the health of their employer. There is a scene that appears in medieval manuscript illustrations with striking regularity. A bed, usually a four-poster, usually curtained, with multiple figures in it. Not always a couple, sometimes a lord and his personal attendant, sometimes several servants, sometimes what appears to be an entire family. The figures are arranged in layers, pressed together, a tangle of nightgowns and nightcaps, and presumably elbows and knees, sharing a common pool of warmth under a common weight of bedclothes. Modern viewers tend to find these images either amusingly intimate or faintly shocking, depending on their tolerance for medieval arrangements. What these illustrations actually document is one of the most effective and widely practiced thermal survival strategies in the medieval world: body heat pooling. Here's the physics, bluntly stated. A single human body produces roughly 80 watts of heat. 2 human bodies produce 160 watts. 3 produce 240 watts. That's not a small difference in the context of a cold room. Put enough bodies in a shared sleeping space, and you change the thermal dynamics of that space in ways that go beyond simple addition. The shared body heat warms the air in the enclosed space, which in turn reduces each individual's heat loss, which keeps more of that 80 watts per person in the system instead of escaping into the cold. Medieval people didn't know any of this in terms of watts or thermal dynamics. What they knew was that sleeping alone in winter was cold, and sleeping with others was less cold. They drew the obvious practical conclusion. Bed sharing in the medieval period operated at virtually every level of society. And understanding it requires shedding several layers of modern assumption. In the modern Western world, the privacy of the bed is close to absolute. The bed is one of the most private spaces in life, and sharing it with someone implies either intimate partnership or extreme emergency. In the medieval period, neither of these assumptions held. Sharing a bed was a normal feature of hospitality, of household organization, of travel, and of daily life. A lord might share his bed with a trusted squire on a cold night, not from any erotic motivation, but from the same logic that led soldiers to share sleeping rolls on campaign. The cold doesn't care about your dignity. Inns and medieval inns were, by modern standards, extremely casual about the mixing of strangers. Routinely put multiple travelers into the same bed. A traveler arriving at an inn in the late medieval period would typically expect to share a bed with whoever else was sleeping in that room, possibly including people they had never met before boarding that day. The historical record is full of travelers' accounts of this practice, ranging from resigned acceptance to active indignation. One English merchant, traveling in France in the 1380s, wrote a letter home describing a night at an inn where he shared a bed with a German wool trader, a French monk, and a dog of unknown breed and indeterminate odor. His feelings about this were complicated, but he noted, somewhat grudgingly, that he had been adequately warm. For servants in a noble household, sleeping in proximity to the lord or lady they served was not just conventional, it was required. The body servant, the personal attendant, the trusted squire, these people slept in the same room and often the same bed as their principal, Partly this was for practical reasons. The Lord might need assistance in the night, and there was no bell pull or intercom to summon help. But the thermal logic was also there, even if it wasn't explicitly articulated. Now, let's talk about the dogs. The phrase, three-dog night, meaning a night so cold it required sleeping with 3 dogs for warmth, appears in various forms in the historical record across multiple Northern European cultures. And while the specific phrasing may be more recent, the practice it describes is thoroughly documented in medieval sources. Dogs were sleeping partners for medieval people at essentially every level of society, and their value was understood to be partly thermal. Think about what a large dog represents as a heat source. A mature English Mastiff or Irish Wolfhound, the kinds of dogs kept by noble households, can weigh 100 pounds or more and maintain a body temperature slightly higher than a human's. Pressed against the feet at the end of a cold bed, a large dog is equivalent to a moderately effective electric blanket that also breathes and occasionally licks you. At the foot of a medieval bed, where the extremities were furthest from the body's core and most vulnerable to heat loss, a dog or two curled across the feet could make a significant difference to overnight comfort. For people who weren't noble, and in the medieval world that was most people, the available animals were less glamorous. Dogs, yes, but also cats, which were smaller and less impressive as heat sources, but cost less to feed. In rural households, the proximity of livestock created its own warmth economy. One of the most common arrangements in peasant dwellings of the early medieval period was the longhouse, a single-roofed structure in which the human family occupied one end and the livestock occupied the other, with only a low internal partition between them. This arrangement was not primitive ignorance. It was thermal engineering. A cow produces enormous amounts of body heat. Housing your animals in the same structure as your family wasn't just convenient. In winter, it was one of the primary reasons the family survived. The monasteries illuminate communal sleeping particularly well. Monastic rules specified communal sleeping arrangements not only for reasons of spiritual discipline, but for practical reasons that the monastic founders would not have been too spiritually elevated to acknowledge. A dormitory of 40 monks sleeping in rows of narrow cots, separated by a few inches of cold stone floor, sharing the same enclosed space, generated collectively what no individual could generate alone. A reservoir of body heat that kept the room temperature bearable through the long winter night. Soldiers on campaign dealt with the same mathematics. The standard sleeping arrangement for medieval infantry in winter quarters was shoulder to shoulder, not from any shortage of space, but because soldiers understood through experience that spreading out was cold and bunching together was warm. A soldier on the edges of a sleeping cluster was miserable. A soldier in the center was comfortable enough to sleep soundly. Rank determined where you were in the cluster. The lowest status men were on the edges. The most senior were in the middle. Warmth in the medieval world was a privilege that tracked closely with power. The thermal arithmetic of communal sleeping extended into some surprising social territories that modern readers might find counterintuitive. Consider the case of the medieval hospital. The hospitium, or hospital, in the broad medieval sense of the word, which covered not just medical facilities, but also charitable houses for the poor, the sick, and travelers. These institutions routinely housed multiple patients in a single bed, not from any shortage of beds, but because bed sharing was understood to be medically beneficial in certain circumstances. The warmth of a bedfellow was prescribed in some medieval medical texts as a specific treatment for certain cold-related conditions. The famous, and perhaps apocryphal, story of King David in the Old Testament, in which an old and cold king is given a young woman to lie beside him to warm his aged body, was cited repeatedly in medieval medical literature as both a precedent and a therapeutic model. Warming an old person with the body heat of a young, healthy companion was understood as legitimate medicine, grounded in the humoral theory that young bodies had more of the warm, vital humors and could share that vitality with the old. We can say confidently that the physiology was wrong and the ethics were complicated. We can also say that the practice of warming an elderly or ill person with the body heat of a companion, understood purely as thermal management and nothing else, was not without physical logic. The thermal value of human contact extends beyond simple radiated heat. Research in modern hypothermia management indicates that skin-to-skin contact between a hypothermic patient and a warm companion is among the most effective rewarming methods available, more efficient in some circumstances than blankets or hot packs because it eliminates the air gap that reduces heat transfer in fabric-based insulation. Medieval people had arrived at a version of this understanding through pure empiricism, centuries of experience with cold, and with what helped. They didn't know the physiology, they knew the outcome. Interestingly, the dog in the bed practice has been documented archaeologically in addition to textually. Zooarchaeological analysis of bone deposits in medieval castle sites has found dog bones in contexts suggesting domestic integration, dogs living, eating, and presumably sleeping alongside their human companions in the residential areas of castles, not kenneled outside as working animals, but integrated into the household in ways that suggest the close proximity we'd associate with pet keeping. The medieval understanding of dogs as household members rather than purely as working animals has a longer and more deeply embedded history than is sometimes appreciated. Different dog breeds were valued for different purposes in the medieval warming economy, if we can call it that. Large dogs, mastiffs, wolfhounds, Telonts were valued for the sheer thermal mass they represented. A 100-pound dog lying across your feet is a significant heat source. Smaller dogs, the lapdogs, the spaniels, the small terriers favored by ladies, were valued for their ability to be tucked against the body, providing concentrated warmth to the torso or the specifically cold spots that the bedding didn't adequately address. One particularly charming detail from the records is the evidence that medieval people recognized the thermal hierarchy of dogs just as they recognized the thermal hierarchy of humans. The choicest spot in a noble bed, the warmest, most sheltered position, was not given to the highest-ranking human in the room. It was sometimes given to the highest-ranking dog, a beloved and highly valued hunting dog, a personal favorite of the lord or lady, might occupy the position at the center of the bed, while lower-status humans slept on floor pallets. The logic was thermal. Put the best heat source where the heat was most needed. But it also tells us something about the effective relationships between medieval people and their animals. Relationships that were simultaneously practical, hierarchical, and genuinely warm in both the literal and emotional sense. Beyond dogs and humans, the thermal value of livestock in winter is documented most vividly in the accounts of travelers rather than household records. When travelers, merchants, pilgrims, officials, wandering scholars were forced to spend winter nights in rural areas between towns, they often chose to sleep in barns and stables alongside the animals rather than in unheated outbuildings or tents. Not from poverty, but from preference. A well-populated barn on a cold night, a dozen cattle, 20 or 30 sheep, several horses, various smaller animals could maintain an interior air temperature 20 degrees above the outside temperature through the combined body heat of its occupants. This was warmth you couldn't replicate in a tent. This was warmth that kept you from waking up hypothermic. The pilgrimage literature of the medieval period contains numerous accounts of this practice, usually presented without embarrassment. Pilgrims sleeping with animals was not shameful or degrading in the medieval context. It was sensible. It was what you did. The associations we now have with animal proximity, associations built on centuries of germ theory and sanitation culture that the medieval world entirely lacked, would have been incomprehensible. The animals were warm. The animals were there. You slept with the animals. The logic was both simple and sound. It's the middle of the night, somewhere between midnight and 2 in the morning. The fire has burned down to coals. The candle guttered out an hour ago. The castle is at its coldest. The walls have been radiating chill for hours, and the small pocket of warmth inside the bed curtains is noticeably smaller and less insulating than it was when you first climbed in. And you wake up, not from a nightmare, not from a sound, though there are sounds, the creak of timber contracting in the cold, the distant bark of a dog in the courtyard, the faint scrape of the watch's boots on the stone of the battlements. You wake up because this is when you wake up. This is the first sleep, what medieval people simply called it, without any particular sense that it was unusual or fragmentary. The first sleep. Modern sleep researchers, working from both historical documents and experimental sleep studies, have established fairly convincingly that the assumption of a single, unbroken 8-hour sleep is not a natural human baseline. It appears to be a relatively modern cultural construct, emerging roughly with the industrial period and the introduction of artificial lighting that extended the usable evening hours. Before that, across most of human history, the dominant pattern appears to have been 2 sleep phases: a first sleep of 3 to 4 hours, a period of quiet wakefulness lasting 1 to 2 hours, and then a second sleep that lasted until dawn. Roger E. Kirch, the historian who did the most systematic research on this topic, found references to first sleep and second sleep throughout medieval and early modern European literature. not as descriptions of unusual arrangements, but as matter-of-fact references to the normal structure of a night. In a medieval castle, in winter, that period of wakefulness in the middle of the night served a function that went beyond the merely physiological. It was when you tended the fire. Keeping a fire alive through a winter night in a large stone chamber was a genuine maintenance task. The wood that burned vigorously through the early evening was coals and ash by midnight, and coals and ash, without new fuel, were cold by 2 or 3 in the morning. Someone had to get up, leave the warmth of the bed, cross the cold floor, kneel at the hearth, blow on the embers to bring them back to life, and add new fuel. In a household with servants, this task fell to the lowest-ranking person in the room, the most junior servant, sleeping on a floor pallet, already in the coldest position, whose job it was to wake and serve regardless of personal comfort. In monasteries, bells rang at intervals through the night to call brothers to prayer. Matins, lauds, the canonical hours of the night office. These prayer watches served, perhaps incidentally, but certainly practically, the secondary purpose of ensuring that someone was always awake, always moving through the building, always capable of noticing a dying fire or responding to a thermal emergency. The structure of monastic prayer was, among its many other functions, a mechanism for fire maintenance. The practical wisdom encoded in this practice goes deeper than simple fire maintenance. The period of wakefulness between first and second sleep was, in the medieval understanding, a time of unusual mental clarity and spiritual receptivity. Medical writers of the period recommended using it for prayer, for quiet reflection, for the resolution of problems that had resisted solution during the day. Priests described the hours between first and second sleep as particularly conducive to religious experience. Now, for the warming drinks. The role of food and drink in medieval thermal management was not incidental. It was systematic, understood, and built into the routines of households at every level. The evening meal was understood, among other things, as a thermal event, an opportunity to fill the body with warmth that would help sustain it through the night. Pottage, thick, porridge-like stews of grain, legumes, and whatever vegetables and meat were available, was the foundation of the evening meal for most medieval people. Its thermal value was not subtle. A large bowl of hot pottage provided both the direct warmth of hot food entering the digestive system and the sustained metabolic energy of a substantial caloric load. Digesting food generates heat, a phenomenon called diet-induced thermogenesis. A body that has consumed a large warm meal before sleep is actively generating more heat during the early sleep hours than a body that went to bed hungry and cold. For those who could afford it, the evening drink was often mulled wine or spiced ale. Hot beverages, sweetened with honey, spiced with cinnamon, ginger, cloves, and whatever other warming spices were available. The thermal logic is partly genuine. A hot drink does briefly raise core body temperature and dilate blood vessels, producing a feeling of warmth. And in the medieval medical framework, the humoral theory of medicine, warming spices like ginger and cinnamon were specifically understood as thermal correctives, substances that counteracted cold humors and promoted the internal warmth that health required. Heated stones, wrapped in cloth and placed at the foot of the bed, served a similar function. They worked on the same principle as a modern hot water bottle, thermal mass, slowly releasing stored heat into the bedding and the body's most cold-sensitive extremities over the course of hours. Accounts mention stones, bricks, and in one documented case, bags filled with heated sand, which retained heat even longer than stone, and conformed more closely to the contours of the feet. And then there was the medicine that wasn't medicine. The boundary between practical warmth strategy and spiritual or magical protection in the medieval world was not a clear line. It was a gradient, and most medieval people operated somewhere in the middle of it without feeling any particular need to choose sides. A woman who hung a sprig of juniper above her bed before sleep was engaging simultaneously in an act with practical consequences. Juniper has a strong, clean scent that may have helped mask the odors of the chamber, and an act with spiritual meaning. Juniper was understood to be protective against evil, against disease, against the bad air that medieval medicine associated with night illness. Similarly, the practice of placing iron objects, a knife, a pair of scissors, whose iron nails beneath the pillow or under the bed frame served overlapping purposes. Iron was believed, in the folk traditions of most Northern European cultures, to be specifically hostile to evil spirits, fairies, and demonic entities. Sleeping with iron nearby was protection against supernatural interference with sleep, but a knife under the pillow also had obvious practical uses as a defensive weapon in a world where the security of private chambers was never entirely guaranteed. The spiritual and the practical overlapped completely, and trying to separate them, to say that the knife was really there for defense, or really there as spiritual protection, misses how medieval people actually thought. It was both. At the same time, without contradiction, the garlic, the inverted shoes, the bound wrists. These were the folk practices, charming in the telling, sometimes hilarious in retrospect, but not trivial in their context. Eating garlic before bed to prevent frostbite, nonsense as a direct thermal mechanism, but garlic does have genuine effects on circulation and blood vessel dilation that might, at the margins, have had some small truth to them. Placing shoes upside down beside the bed to keep frost from the feet, pure sympathetic magic by any rational analysis, but the act of engaging with the fear, of performing a gesture of protection against a known danger, likely had genuine psychological value in reducing the anxiety that impeded sleep. Medical texts of the period are earnest and detailed on these matters. Oil of rosemary rubbed on the feet before sleep to open the pores and prevent chill from entering. Warmed milk with honey to soothe the stomach and balance the cold humors of the night air. A live rooster in the bedchamber to draw away the frost from man. This last prescription from an English herbal of the 14th century, and one can only wonder at the practicalities of its implementation, because that's what this was at its core. Desperate ingenuity. The castle was cold. You couldn't change the stone. You couldn't change the wind. You couldn't install central heating. What you could do was layer every strategy available to you. Practical, communal, spiritual, medicinal, superstitious, into a comprehensive system for surviving the night. The medical framework within which medieval people understood cold and warmth deserves more than a footnote. Humoral theory, the idea that the body was governed by 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, which had to remain in proper balance and whose balance was affected by temperature, diet, emotion, and environment, was not folk superstition. It was the dominant medical paradigm of the learned world, taught in medical schools, practiced by physicians, and taken seriously by the educated classes across Europe from roughly the 12th century onward. Its relationship to cold management was explicit, detailed, and consequential. Cold, in humoral theory, was understood to thicken and congeal the humors, slowing their circulation and reducing the vital warmth that healthy bodies required. A person who had been exposed to excessive cold was at risk of an imbalance toward phlegm, the cold, moist humor, which was associated with sluggishness, respiratory illness, and a general reduction of vital energy. The medical response to this threat was, logically enough, warming interventions, warm food, warm drink, warm environments, physical activity to generate internal heat, and the application of warming substances to the skin. The warming herbs and spices that appear constantly in medieval recipes for pre-sleep drinks and food preparations, ginger, cinnamon, cloves, pepper, nutmeg, were not merely flavor. They were medicine. They were understood as specifically heating substances, warmth made tangible and ingestible, capable of counteracting the cold humors that winter nights threatened to introduce. The fact that hot ginger tea does actually produce a sensation of warmth, that cinnamon does have mild vasodilatory effects, that spicy foods cause a genuine physiological warming response. These things are not coincidences. The humoral physicians were working from empirical observation, even when their theoretical framework for explaining the observations was wrong. The instruction to rub the feet with warm oil before sleeping appears in multiple medieval medical texts from different regions and centuries. The oil, typically olive oil, sometimes infused with warming herbs, was described as opening the pores and allowing the body's internal warmth to circulate more freely, preventing the cold from entering through the extremities. The actual mechanism was different from what was described. The massage improved circulation to the feet, which genuinely do lose heat rapidly and are an important part of thermal regulation. The oil provided a slight occlusive barrier against evaporative cooling, and the act of vigorous rubbing generated local warmth directly. The physicians were right about the outcome. They were wrong about the mechanism. They would not have cared about the distinction. Folk practices existed in a space adjacent to, but distinct from learned medicine, drawing from the same empirical well of observation, but interpreting it through different frameworks: local tradition, religious understanding, inherited practice, and the kind of practical wisdom that doesn't require a theoretical framework to be effective. The practices around cold management that we find in household manuals, agricultural texts, and the few surviving accounts of peasant life are sometimes indistinguishable from learned medicine and sometimes clearly in a different register. More magical, more symbolic, more tied to specific spiritual beliefs. The placement of iron under the pillow belongs firmly in the magical category, And it's worth taking a moment to understand what medieval people thought they were protecting against when they did this. Iron's power to repel supernatural entities, fairies, demons, the various beings that were believed to intrude on sleep and cause harm to sleeping people, was one of the most widespread beliefs in Northern European folk tradition. But the beings that iron was specifically meant to repel were not generic supernatural threats. They were, in a significant proportion of the accounts, specifically associated with cold and with night. The night hag, the mare, the various entities that were blamed for the experience of sleep paralysis and for waking in the night in a cold sweat with a sense of oppression. These were cold beings. Beings of the winter dark, and iron was their specific vulnerability. Whether or not these beings existed, the anxiety about them tells us something important about the medieval experience of sleeping in cold, dark, isolated stone chambers. The darkness itself was a threat, in a way that we've largely forgotten in the age of artificial lighting. A medieval castle chamber at night was dark in a way that most modern people have never experienced. Not dim, not gloomy, but genuinely, completely, almost physically dark. The absence of light outside the immediate reach of a single candle or a few embers was total. And in that darkness, in that cold, in the long hours between first and second sleep, the imagination populated the space with whatever was most feared. The rituals of protection, the iron, the herbs, the prayers, the turned shoes, the invocations of saints were management strategies for that fear, as much as for the physical threats. They were psychological insulation, operating in parallel with the physical insulation of the blankets and the canopy bed. You couldn't sleep if you were afraid. You couldn't sleep well if your imagination was generating cold, dark danger signals every time the candle guttered or a gust found a gap in the shutters. The rituals quieted the imagination. They told it, "You have done what can be done. The iron is there. The prayer has been said. The herbs are hanging. You may now sleep." Whether they worked is the wrong question. They worked for what they were designed to do. They created the psychological conditions in which sleep was possible in a cold, dark, frightening environment. And that was exactly what was needed. The warming pan's cultural significance extended beyond its practical function in ways that reveal something about the emotional landscape of medieval bedtime. It appears in accounts not just as a utilitarian tool, but as a symbol of care, of the attention paid by a household to its members' comfort and safety. The personal servant who ran the warming pan through the sheets before the lord or lady's bedtime was performing an act that signaled their principal's value and the household's resources. The guest who found their bed pre-warmed upon arriving at a noble house had received a message about their standing in their host's estimation. And the soldier or traveler or student who climbed into cold sheets without a warming pan had received the opposite message, or no message at all, which was perhaps worse. In some records, the warming pan appears as a gift, a high-quality brass warming pan presented to a newly married couple or given by a lord to a favored servant. As a gift, it carried the clear meaning of warmth and care, of practical provision for the fundamental human need to sleep warmly. It was in a world where abstract emotional declarations were less common than concrete provision of necessities, a statement in the language that mattered most. I will ensure that you are warm. We've reached the end of the night. The second sleep is over. Somewhere in the walls, in the cold gray stone that has absorbed the darkness for hours, the first faint suggestion of morning begins. Not warmth, not yet, but a slight easing of the deepest cold, a barely perceptible shift in the quality of the silence outside. Frost has formed on the inside of the window frame. The wash basin by the wall contains a solid disk of ice where the water was last night. Your breath in the curtained space of the bed is visible even here, even inside the enclosure, even under all this wool and fur. You have survived the night. It is worth pausing on that for a moment. Not with relief, exactly, though there's some of that. With something more like awe at the simple, daily, unremarked fact of it. You survived the night. You did it through a combination of architectural adaptation, material layering, communal warmth, ritual preparation, spiritual attention, and sheer determined resistance to the cold. You did it the way everyone in this building did it, the way everyone in this building had learned to do it from childhood, the way their parents had learned it, and their parents' parents, going back through centuries of stone and cold and fire and wool and prayers whispered in the dark. And now, before we part ways with the medieval night, there's one more truth to confront. The most surprising one. The one that has been sitting quietly at the edge of this story, waiting. Here it is. The lord in the castle was probably not the warmest person in the valley on a cold January night. Think about everything we've established. The stone walls that stored cold. The vast chambers impossible to heat from a single fireplace. The architectural grandeur that was, thermally speaking, catastrophically counterproductive. The requirement for private sleeping, for a separate room, a separate bed, a status-appropriate distance between the Lord's body and the bodies of servants, that worked directly against the thermal logic of communal heat pooling. The hilltop position that maximized exposure to wind. The unglazed or poorly glazed windows that admitted drafts. The sheer volume of space that was impossible to heat. Now think about the peasant in the valley. The cottage of timber and daub, small enough that a single hearth could warm the whole interior. The thatched roof, 3 feet thick at the peak. A natural insulating layer that a stone ceiling could never match. The floor of packed earth. Cold, but not as cold as stone. The livestock in the adjacent stall, adding their steady, generous body heat to the building's thermal budget. The family sleeping together, husband, wife, children, possibly grandparents, sharing their warmth in a pile of bodies under a heap of coarse woolen covers. The fire never more than 15 feet from any sleeping person. A visitor to an English village in the mid-14th century wrote, with what sounds like genuine surprise, that the peasant hovels he passed through on a cold evening held warmth better than the Lord's tower he had just departed. He meant it as a note on the paradox of poverty and comfort. He had stumbled onto something real. The medieval world's most powerful and wealthy people were, in a very specific way, the victims of their own architectural ambition. The castle was designed to be impressive, to dominate the landscape, to house hundreds of people, to last for centuries. In service of all those goals, it sacrificed the one quality that a simple peasant cottage possessed almost by accident: the ability to trap and hold enough warmth for a human being to sleep through a winter night in comfort. This doesn't mean the peasant had it better overall. Let's be clear about that. The peasant in the valley faced cold in ways the lord in the castle didn't. In the fields, on the roads, in every outdoor hour of labor. The peasant's diet was inferior, their medical options were worse, their life expectancy was lower. Their warmth at night was one small advantage in a generally much harder existence. But that one advantage is real. And it matters for what it tells us about the nature of comfort and the gap between appearance and reality. The romantic image of medieval castle life, the roaring fire, the feast, the warm candlelit chambers hung with tapestries, captures something real about isolated moments. The feast hall on a feast night, with 100 bodies and a dozen fires, was warm. The lord's great four-poster bed, with its curtains drawn and its occupant buried under furs, was survivably warm. But these were performances of warmth, not steady states of comfort. They required constant, effortful maintenance. They were always one dying fire, one missing servant, one unusually cold night away from failure. The peasant's warmth was simpler, humbler, and in some ways more reliable because it had fewer failure points. You can't fail to maintain a room too small to fail to heat. You can't let the central hearth die if it's 4 feet from where you sleep. You can't sleep alone when there are 5 people and a cow generating heat in a space 12 feet across. Simplicity in the thermal management game was a kind of robustness. There's a lesson in this that extends beyond the medieval period. What we can say, simply, is that the people who designed and lived in medieval castles were solving an extremely difficult thermal problem with the tools they had, and that some of their solutions were brilliant. The canopy bed as microclimate, the fur coverlet as portable Arctic survival gear, the warming pan as preheating device, the shared bed as collective thermal management, while others were, at best, coping strategies for a fundamentally intractable situation. They were, all of them, lord and servant, monk and soldier, pilgrim and peasant, survivalists in the most literal sense. Every night they went to bed, they were placing a bet on a collection of strategies that they hoped, collectively, would keep them alive until morning. That's the truth that movies don't show you. Not because it's not interesting, but because it's not comfortable. It makes the castle less romantic and more real. And reality is harder to sell than romance. But there's something in the reality that the romance can never offer: the genuine weight of human ingenuity under pressure. These people, with no central heating, no synthetic insulation, no double-glazed windows, no thermostat, no electric blanket, and no guarantee that tonight would not be the night the cold finally won. These people figured it out, layer by layer, ritual by ritual, dog by dog, prayer by prayer. They created warmth where the architecture provided none. They built community around the need to survive. They developed practices that, stripped of their period-specific context, are recognizable as solutions to recognizable problems. The nightcap is a hat. The bed curtains are a tent. The warming pan is a hot water bottle. The mulled wine is a hot drink before bed. The shared sleep is a sleeping pile. The fire watch is a middle-of-the-night alarm. The aromatic herbs are an air freshener. None of these things require a medieval castle to make sense. They require a cold night and a determination to be warm when morning comes. So tonight, when you lie down in whatever your bed is, on your mattress with its synthetic foam and its temperature-regulating cover, in your room with its forced air heating controlled by a thermostat on the wall, under your duvet filled with down or polyester, in a building with double-glazed windows sealed against the January wind, spare a thought for the people who slept in stone chambers. Not pity. They didn't want pity, and they didn't have the luxury of thinking in those terms. They had a problem to solve, and they solved it every night with everything they had. What they deserve is respect, the specific earned respect of one survivor for another. They kept the fire going. They made it to morning, and so did we. The comparison between noble and peasant sleep that we've been building toward all evening requires one more layer of nuance before we can properly appreciate it. Because the peasant's warmth advantage in winter, real as it was, coexisted with genuine deprivations that the noble's cold stone chamber never imposed. The peasant's cottage was not just small and warm, it was also smoky, in a way that even the worst-drawing castle fireplace never quite matched. In the early medieval period, and in the humbler rural dwellings throughout the period, the central hearth was exactly that. A fire on the floor of the room, with no chimney, relying entirely on the leakiness of the thatch and the gaps in the walls to allow the smoke to dissipate. This meant that the air in a peasant cottage during winter was essentially always smoky. Not dramatically. Dramatically smoky. People weren't coughing continuously or going blind from eye irritation, though the long-term respiratory effects were certainly serious. But there was a baseline level of smoke in the air that was simply a permanent feature of indoor life. The smoke had benefits. It preserved the thatch, killing the insects and pathogens that would otherwise degrade it. It flavored and preserved food hanging in the rafters, and the layer of smoke that collected in the upper part of the room acted counterintuitively as an additional insulating layer between the living space and the cold air above the thatch. But it also meant that everyone in the cottage was breathing smoke continuously, and the long-term health effects, chronic respiratory conditions, increased susceptibility to respiratory infections, a decreased lung capacity, were real. The noble in his stone chamber, despite all the cold and discomfort, was at least breathing cleaner air. Even a badly drawing castle fireplace sent most of its smoke up the chimney, keeping the ambient air in the room better than the smoke-filled interior of a thatched cottage. This was one genuine advantage of the stone architecture that the thermal comparisons tend to obscure. The comparison also needs to account for the difference in what happened when the worst nights came. When the temperature dropped below the capacity of either the castle's management strategies or the peasants' shared warmth to fully compensate. In those extremes, the noble had resources and options that the peasant did not. More wood could be obtained, if expensively. Additional servants could be moved into the chamber to provide more body heat. Extra furs could be brought from the storeroom. A physician could be summoned if cold-related illness developed. The buffer between the noble's management capacity and the point at which cold became life-threatening was considerably larger than the peasant's buffer, even if, in normal conditions, the peasant was actually warmer. This is the final, deepest irony of medieval thermal management. The people with the most resources, the lords, the great ladies, the senior clergy, the wealthy merchants, had the most elaborate management systems, the most expensive equipment, and the widest safety margin against catastrophic failure. But they needed all of that complexity and all of those resources precisely because their architectural environment was so thermally hostile. Their wealth bought them not comfort, but survivability, not warmth, but the slightly less cold end of the cold spectrum. The people with the fewest resources, the rural poor in their smoky, crowded, animal-shared hovels, had the most naturally efficient thermal environments and the most effective natural heat sources, but they had almost no safety margin. A particularly bad winter, a death in the family that reduced the number of bodies sharing warmth, a sick cow, a fire that got out of control and burned the thatch. Any of these could eliminate the advantage entirely and leave a peasant family genuinely cold, genuinely threatened, with no resources to fall back on. Medieval thermal survival was thus, at every level of society, a matter of managing margin. The rich managed a large margin badly. The poor managed a small margin well. And everyone on the worst nights discovered that margin was exactly what they had, and nothing more. There is a particular image I want to leave you with. Not a dramatic one, not a scene of crisis or triumph, a quiet one. It's late January, somewhere in northern England, around the year 1280, sometime after midnight. The first sleep is over, and the household is beginning to stir in the way that households always do at this hour. Small movements, quiet sounds, the rustle of someone adding wood to a fire. In the Lord's chamber, the body servant rises from his pallet, crosses the cold floor in his bare feet, and kneels at the hearth to blow on the coals and add a fresh log. His breath makes a little cloud in the cold air. In the village below the castle, in a low house with a thatched roof and a central hearth, a woman wakes and does the same thing, rises from the pile of sleeping bodies, crosses the shorter distance to the fire, feeds it a log, returns. In the monastery a mile away, a bell rings, and monks rise from their dormitory beds for the night office, their breath clouding in the cold stone corridor as they file toward the chapel. 3 different settings, 3 different levels of wealth and status and protection, 3 different thermal situations with different advantages and different risks, but the same act performed at the same hour, driven by the same fundamental necessity. Keep the fire going. Make it to morning. That act, rising in the cold dark to tend the fire that keeps everyone else warm, is as human an act as exists in the historical record. It requires nothing from us in the way of exotic explanation or romantic interpretation. It just is what it is. A person, in the middle of the night, in the cold, doing what has to be done so that life continues. The people we've been talking about tonight were not exotic figures from a distant and incomprehensible world. They were people solving the same problems we solve with the same basic human equipment we have: intelligence, observation, ingenuity, stubbornness, cooperation, love for the people sleeping beside them. They did it without central heating, without synthetic insulation, without the accumulated technological resources of the intervening centuries. They did it with stone and fire and wool and prayer and dogs and herbs and the warmth of each other's bodies. And they did it, most nights, successfully. That's worth remembering. Not because their lives were harder than ours, though they were. Not because we should feel guilty about our heated homes. We shouldn't. But because the distance between us and them, measured in capacity for survival and ingenuity and adaptability, is much smaller than the distance in technology might suggest. They weren't primitive. They weren't ignorant. They were doing their absolute best with what they had, in service of the most fundamental human need there is. They wanted to be warm. They wanted to sleep safely. They wanted to wake up. Tonight, in your warm bed, with your central heating and your sealed windows and your thick synthetic duvet, you have what they spent their winters fighting for. I hope you enjoy every second of it. Drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from and what time it is there. Is it cold where you are tonight? How cold? Tell us. We want to know. And if this journey through the medieval dark resonated with you, if you found yourself genuinely moved by the ingenuity and resilience of the people who slept in stone chambers and made it to morning, subscribe. Share this with someone who loves history, or someone who loves sleeping. They're often the same person. We'll see you next time in the dark by the fire. Sleep well.